The physiology of the female reproductive system has its own name called the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle is a series of changes each month that allows a female to reproduce. It is a three-part process that involves ovulation, changes in the uterine lining, and menstruation. Menstruation is when an unfertilized egg and lining of the uterus leaves the body in a menstrual flow, also known as a female's period. The menstrual cycle occurs over an average of 28 to 32 days. It is different for every single female, and it actually varies between cycles. For example, one cycle could be 28 days, whereas the next cycle could be 31 days, or 27 days, or even 25 days. All periods vary, which is completely normal. And in fact, teens typically have irregular cycles. So it is normal for a teen to maybe have a period 1 month and then skip a month, because their bodies are still getting used to this cycle occurring every single month. The menstrual cycle begins with the first day of menstruation. So the very first day a female has her period is day 1 of the menstrual cycle. This usually lasts between 5 to 8 days. And again, it can vary from cycle to cycle and person to person. This is where the uterine lining, also known as the endometrium, is leaving the body. And this endometrium consists of blood, tissue, and fluids. At the same time the endometrium is leaving the body, an egg is starting to mature in the ovaries. The egg or ovum that's maturing in the ovaries doesn't reach its full maturation level until the very middle of the cycle. So it's usually about day 14 if we're thinking of a 28-day menstrual cycle. When it's fully mature, that's when ovulation will occur. And ovulation is release of a mature egg into the fallopian tube. The follicle bursts open and an ovum is released. It's swept up by those fimbriae, those finger-like projections on the end of the fallopian tubes, and travels through the fallopian tube. It does take a little while for that egg to travel through the fallopian tube, so usually about 4 to 14 days after ovulation is when it reaches that uterus. If the egg is fertilized, it will occur in the upper 2/3 of the fallopian tube. One other thing I want to point out is that when ovulation occurs, it usually only occurs in one ovary at a time, and typically they switch off every month. So if an egg is released from the left ovary, the next month or the next cycle, an egg will be released from the right ovary. That's not always the case for every single female. Some females only release eggs from their left one, some only release from their right. Sometimes it's 2 from the same, or for 2 cycles it comes from the same one and then it comes from the next one. It's just different for every person, which is totally normal. Now, typically a female will release 1 egg per cycle. However, one way that we get multiples is when a female releases more than 1 egg during one cycle. For example, fraternal twins occur when 2 eggs have been released, either from the same ovary or one from each ovary, and are fertilized individually by 2 different sperm. So the fraternal twins do not share the same DNA. They can be of the same sex or different sexes, so male, male, female, female, male, female, etc. Fertilization is the union of an ovum and a sperm. Only 1 sperm can fertilize 1 egg. Once that egg or ovum has been fertilized by the sperm, the egg actually forms a protective outer layer to prevent other sperm from invading that egg and fertilizing it as well. And as I said before, fertilization will occur in the upper 2/3 of the fallopian tubes. Vaginal intercourse is the only type of intercourse that results in fertilization. So that sperm will enter the vagina from the penis. It will go through the cervix, into the uterus, and into both fallopian tubes, because the sperm doesn't know what ovary that egg is released from. So it will cover all of its directions. And remember, there's 700 million of them on average, so there's a lot of possibilities there. So the sperm will travel through the fallopian tubes until it potentially will meet an egg for fertilization. And only one sperm fertilizes one egg. After ovulation occurs, the uterine wall will again start to thicken with that blood, tissue, and fluid to potentially nourish a fertilized egg as it grows. So the body has to prepare itself each cycle for that possibility of a fertilized egg. If the ovum is not fertilized, it will either disintegrate in the uterus or it will leave the body in the menstrual flow at the beginning of the next cycle. If you're confused about this timeline for the menstrual cycle, let's make it really easy here. So day 1 is menstruation. And menstruation lasts 5 to 8 days. In the very middle of the cycle, let's say the cycle is 28 days. Day 14 is ovulation. So that's when that egg is being released from the follicle and is swept up into the fallopian tubes. Now this time between day 1 and day 14 is when that egg or ovum is maturing. And then the time between ovulation and the last day of the cycle, so the day before menstruation occurs, that endometrium is thickening. So it's preparing itself for a fertilized ovum or egg. So hopefully that makes it a little bit more clear. Hopefully my writing isn't too messy for you to read. What controls the whole menstrual cycle are the female reproductive sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen is the primary female sex hormone. It plays a role in the very first part or the very first half of the menstrual cycle. So it prepares that follicle and egg for ovulation. So that is the hormone that is responsible for maturing this egg to be released. It increases in the middle of the menstrual cycle, so it peaks right in the middle, right before ovulation, to help stimulate that release of the ovum from a follicle. Progesterone is a hormone that changes the lining of the uterus. So it is a result of that corpus luteum, which is that yellow-bodied temporary gland that releases progesterone and comes into play after ovulation. So progesterone will gradually increase after ovulation to prepare the uterus for a potential fertilized egg. Now, if somebody were pregnant, we would see higher levels of progesterone secreted because the uterus is maintaining that uterine lining or endometrium. If you were having trouble understanding all of that, I found this chart online that made it make complete sense to me. So if you're a visual learner, this chart is going to help you out a lot. It has 3 different layers to the chart. The follicular development, so how that egg matures and the follicle changes. It shows how hormone levels change throughout the cycle and how the endometrium or that uterine lining changes. So it starts on day 1, so the very first day of the menstrual cycle, all the way to the last day of the cycle, which for this one, on average, it's 28 days. So that's pretty much what every chart you see online is going to have. So if we look at that follicle development, it's pretty small because the follicle hasn't developed very much because the egg hasn't matured yet. But as we go through the cycle, right up until ovulation, that follicle is getting much, much bigger because that egg is maturing. Once it gets to ovulation, that egg is fully matured and is released from the ovary. After ovulation, that's where that follicle turns into the corpus luteum, that yellow-bodied substance that secretes progesterone. Okay, so that's how the follicle develops. At the same time, our hormone levels are going to be increasing. So estrogen is that yellow line there, and that is going to be pretty low on day 1, but as we progress closer and closer to ovulation, estrogen is going to gradually increase and peak right before ovulation, because estrogen is all about maturing that egg. That's what its main goal is to make that egg mature and ready to be released at ovulation. So it's going to peak right before ovulation because that's when we want the egg to be most mature. After ovulation, that estrogen level is going to decrease sharply and not really play too much more of a role the rest of the cycle. But as the cycle starts over again, it will increase again to mature a new egg to be ready for release during the next cycle. Progesterone doesn't come into play until the second half of the cycle, so it's low during the first 1 to 14 days of the cycle. After ovulation, that's when it starts to increase because the follicle doesn't change into the corpus luteum, which releases progesterone, until after ovulation. So as the cycle continues, progesterone is going to peak because that uterine lining is changing. Remember, progesterone is all about changes in the uterine lining. If a female were pregnant, we would see these levels plateau off and remain plateaued until after childbirth. However, if the egg is not fertilized and doesn't attach itself to the uterine wall, progesterone is going to decrease because the body is getting ready to shed that uterine lining. The last part of this chart is the endometrial cycle, so how the uterine lining or the endometrium changes during menstruation or during the menstrual cycle. So on day 1, it's pretty high because that's when a female first is shedding that uterine lining or the first day of their period. So as we go through days 5 through 8, that uterine lining is going to decrease. It's going to stay pretty low, but after ovulation, it's going to increase because progesterone, which changes how thick the uterine lining is. So the more progesterone that's secreted, the thicker the uterine lining. So the endometrium is going to start to increase. If a female were pregnant, we would see this plateau just like progesterone. However, if the egg is not fertilized, then that's going to decrease. So the body is getting ready to shed that lining. It's no longer going to be thickening. So the endometrial cycle falls in line pretty much with progesterone, if you think about it. So I hope this chart makes it a little bit easier to understand the timeline and kind of what's happening at each timeline.